this drug is dangerous. You cannot play with it. It's not funny. It's not something to laugh about. And trying to send that message with clarity that good people don't smoke marijuana.
Every day, every night, all the time. Every day I need an ounce and a half. SP, the only flow that you know, with a bounce and a half. Listen, kid, I need a mountain to cast so I can roll up, hop in the whip and like bounce to the ab. I get high cause I'm in the hood, the guns is around. To take a blunt just to ease the pain and humble me now.
Greetings. Did you know that cannabis is the most commonly utilized federally illegal drug? A recent study showed that over 50 million individuals admitted to having utilized cannabis once. And yet, it is a Schedule I drug on the Controlled Substance Act, deemed as having no medicinal use and a high potential for abuse. In this series of interviews, I speak with experts within the cannabis space. We discuss everything from the public health and the medical concerns to environmental challenges and calls for social justice. There's much to discuss, but even more to learn. Join me on this journey into the emerging cannabis industry. Good afternoon, I'm Dr. Tyson Lloyd Gray, and we are here again for another episode of looking at the cannabis industry and all of the various nuances that comes along with that. I have with me Kristi Price, who is the CEO and founder of Karma Media, as well as Black CannaBusiness magazine. And I want to talk to her today specifically about things related to seed to sell, the various aspects of starting a cannabis business, as well as the challenges that individuals would see if they were trying to do a startup and enter into this industry. Now, first off, Kristi, you have a BA in mass communication.
I do.
I'm just going to go ahead and say you don't look like most people that we see in this space.
Really?
So I would love to hear, how did you find yourself into CannaBusiness, and how did you get yourself into this industry?
Okay, so it's a bit of a story.
Okay, we're ready.
So my formal education is in mass communications and broadcast journalism. So telling stories and informing people has always been a passion of mine. Just organically, I've always wanted to do that. And then following college, like a lot of folks, I didn't follow that trajectory. Like I wasn't on air. I didn't really go into the traditional sense of media, but spent a lot of time after college doing management consulting. So in that role, my job was to help, again, leaning in on communications and training and just helping businesses to solve problems and to communicate the challenges and the solutions of those business issues with their employees or their stakeholders or whomever else was being impacted by these changes. And so over the years, as traveling around the country, as anyone who's ever done management consulting knows, it's 100% travel. So though I'm based in Houston, Texas, my travels took me to California, Colorado, Illinois. It's just starting to think about some of these states, Massachusetts, New York, areas where the talk about the cannabis industry was beginning to kind of pick up, right? So this is like in the very early 2000s, late 90s. Even then, in California and Colorado in particular, those conversations were pretty prevalent. Yeah. And so, as a journalist and an investigator myself, I started to think about, like, really what is this industry really about? Now, all the industries I've been in up before cannabis were also formally prohibited or highly regulated. So alcohol, I was in alcohol for 12 years, alcohol industry. I was in the tobacco industry for about 8 years. So they are all similar in that, again, formally prohibited, which means at one point they were illegal. Those industries were not legal, and they're also highly regulated, which means the government has a very, very heavy involvement in the industry. But then in addition to that, just the businesswoman in me was just kind of like, where are these opportunities and where can I start to figure out how I can get involved? Because again, cannabis is one of those industries like technology, like, gold even way back when, where people were just rushing into this space because there's so much talk about all this money that can be made. And so everyone's trying to figure out how to get in where they fit in, right? And so I took a couple of years of just kind of researching the industry, traveling around the country like I was already doing, but now making a concerted effort to go to conferences and conventions and symposiums and just immersing myself in the industry as a layman, just to kind of understand what the industry shaped up, what it kind of looked like. And I think because of my background in other formerly prohibited industries and the nuances of doing business in those spaces, really gave me, I guess it made me a little braver than I think a lot of folks. I mean, if you've never, been audited, or if no one's ever checked your books or made sure this is paid for, it's a different experience. And so traveling around, again, going to all the conferences, and one of the things I noticed, especially from my perspective, is that there weren't a lot of people of color that I saw. So if you've ever been to any conference or convention, regardless of the industry, if you're a minority, what happens in between the breakouts? You find everybody's like, what are you doing? Where are you going? That kind of thing. And so after years of this, I kind of started to think about, on one hand, I'm a consumer for sure. So I am a love it. We do a little cannabis here and there. But in addition to that, I was trying to solve a problem like I always have. It's like, okay, I'm going to these conferences and conventions. There's, very few people of color on the stage, very few people of color even in attendance. Why is that? So then that led me to start to do more investigation around social equity and really what that meant, and how states were coming online to, as cannabis was becoming legal across the country. I was just really following what those policies were. And so then again, riding in a cab, I was in New York, actually. I was in New York, but I was going to Jersey, because there was, what is this place? It starts with a P. It's like it's right over the bridge. I can't think of the name of it. Anyway, I was on my way there, and I was listening to the radio, and it was on Sirius XM, as a matter of fact, the Urban View. And there were people on there, again, talking about cannabis. Everyone was just looking for information, and no one really had like one place to send folks. Yeah. So as I was contemplating like what I wanted to do in the industry, I knew I wanted to add value, and I knew I wanted to do something that was true to me and like what I'm good at, and that's one of the beautiful things about all industries. As professionals, we should always be looking for ways to transfer our skills to give us a broader opportunity. Absolutely. We talk about multiple streams of income. We talk, that's kind of the lifestyle or the life or the culture that we're in right now. And so it's no different when you're starting any business. And so coupling my mass comm background with my consulting background, I felt like it would be a great mix if I were to create a media company that would educate people of color who were interested in getting involved in the cannabis industry. And that's how Black CannaBusiness was born. Well, actually, Karma Media was born first, and then Black CannaBusiness is our flagship brand. Interesting.
So I love talking to people who kind of take untraditional routes, right, into this space. And even though you're a user, right, so there's love for the product.
I am a consumer.
Yes, there's love for the product, but then also finding ways for your skill set to benefit this area, right? And so with the founding of Karma Media, let's talk a little bit about what do you do, what is your day-to-day, what is the goal and the trajectory of Karma Media and CannaBusiness magazine?
So Karma Media was founded in 2019, and Karma is a play on words. It's an acronym, but each of those letters actually stands for a pillar of our promises, or the promises that we're making as an organization to our community, the cannabis community, and the Black community as well, because we are really focused on Black professionals. And so Karma stands for knowledge. We want to make sure that we are like the one source of like true information for folks who are wanting to start this business. The R is for resources. So once we know that you can come to Black CannaBusiness to get some of this knowledge, we also want to provide resources, because the thing about the industry is, depending on where you live, right, things are different. And so we can't just have a blanket statement about legal or policy issues or any of those things without providing the resources that are relative to folks based on their proximity. And then the M is for minority curation. So everything that we do, all the news, all the information is curated, and it's composed through the lens of people of color. So when we talk about, I know we're going to talk about safe banking, when we talk about, plant touching business versus non-plant touching businesses and the ramifications that those decisions have for communities of color is super important. And so as you're getting into the industry, you know, as a minority, understanding those nuances is super important. And so that's what the M in Karma stands for. And then finally, the A is for, it's really, when we started Karma, A was for amplification only. Like we wanted to amplify the voices of people of color, and not even just people of color, but also our allies who are in the industry making opportunities for us and you know, for the generations to come. And so that's kind of, the A kind of has two meanings. First, we definitely want to make sure that we're letting other Black people know that there are other people of color in the space who are doing probably a lot of the things that people are thinking about doing right now. But then we also recognize that we couldn't get here or do any of this without the cooperation and the support of our allies, who are people who may not be Black or brown, but still believe that the cannabis industry should be inclusive and everyone should have an opportunity to be involved. So that's where Karma came from.
Okay, so sounds good. Sounds like you have a work cut out for you.
Oh my gosh.
One of my favorite quotes is by Dr. King, that justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Correct.
I think it's so apropos in so many scenarios, but even when you think about this space that you're in, right, where you're focusing on how do you bring Black and brown people into this industry, right, how do you educate them, but we know that where there's any injustice, right, ultimately there's injustice for everyone, right?
Correct.
And so when you think about regulations, right, I know that there are certain regulations that perhaps are more harmful to Black and brown people, but what are you seeing just kind of across the board? And it's interesting because we're here in Texas where technically cannabis is not legal, but you know, you're doing work and, you know, as you said, across the country, looking at other states, looking at other regions, what are some of the most harmful regulations that you're saying, specifically for individuals who are attempting to enter this industry, right, whether they're Black or brown, right? What regulations are making it difficult, even on the state level? We know that on the federal level, right, the Schedule 1, you know, illegal status makes it difficult, but for states that are legalizing, right, and they're putting in place these regulatory regimes, right, what are some of the most challenging regulations that we're seeing for entrepreneurs who really want to enter this space?
Well, you know, and it's really, that's a great question because, you know, when you start a business, once you've done your research and you figured out what you want to do, the very first thing most new business owners do is they open a bank account, right? In the business name, because now you have your DBA or maybe you've incorporated or however you're setting up your business, how are you going to make revenue? You know, hopefully we're all setting up businesses to make some money, right?
Absolutely.
So where's that money going to go? And how are we going to be taxed? And, you know, what does that revenue really mean? And so for Black and brown people, I think one of the biggest challenges that we face, no matter where you are in the country, is really banking. Because it's one of the first things we all do when we start a business is you know, coming up with your name and how you're going to operate, and then also how you're going to receive your revenue. And so when you do research into like the Safe Banking Act and 280E and some of those other policies, what you'll find, particularly from those, and I'm not an expert in this space, I don't consider myself an activist, though I do have several colleagues and really close friends who will say that if you really read the fine print in some of these policies, it's not really set up for people of color. And so whereas equity is a great buzzword, the question is it really, are these policies really truly equitable? And one of the things that I really appreciate about Black CannaBusiness and the network that we're building as a media company is that we're able to every day have conversations like this, share with audiences like your students the reality of the challenges that exist in this industry. So aside from just the regular business startup challenges that folks often have, you also have to consider that getting into this industry could also be a little taxing on your nerves when you start to think about taxes, literally, depending on whether you know where you show up in the space. It's just a lot of things to consider that you don't have to consider when you're not in cannabis, particularly with the legal and law, you know.
So that's interesting. So we talk a little bit about the legal landscape and what it looks like from a federal level and a state level, but I actually had not even thought about, you know, just the business startup plan, right? And I've started a nonprofit, I've started a for-profit, and you're right. First things you do, you get your EIN number, you get your tax ID, right? You get your banking account. Are cannabis businesses able to get EIN numbers?
So you can certainly get an EIN number. Okay. No one, you can't. You know, the industry doesn't prevent you from starting a business or becoming a business owner in this space. It just takes a little bit more rigor because there are other things, definitely things you consider. With banking in particular, all banks don't accept cannabis businesses. There are lots of like tools and resources that businesses may leverage that also don't support cannabis. For example, if you're starting a business and you're thinking part of your business is going to be to communicate through a newsletter, for example, about things, there are certain newsletter services that will not allow you, if you're a cannabis business, to use their services, because things that are federally illegal, a lot of times business services don't want to touch because they're like, hey, we don't know what the ramifications are for our, involvement. We don't want to get caught up in, the uncertainty and ambiguity of what, this industry is. And so as we become more online, more services are becoming available, but traditionally, or in the last couple of years, it hadn't been the case.
Okay, so now you're talking a little bit about ancillary services. I do want to get into that because your service would be considered ancillary,
Absolutely.
right? So it's not a cannabis, dispensary, but you're actually servicing cannabis users, right? Are there challenges to running a ancillary cannabis business that are, regulations that makes it also difficult to enter into that industry? Do you find, specifically because you're running a cannabis business, right, in a state where cannabis is illegal, right? And so how does that work in terms of marketing, and how does that work in terms of client acquisition or, things like that?
Well, yeah, you definitely have to think outside of the box, and that's why I always like to preface my conversation with my background, because I don't think I would have been as successful as quickly had it not been for alcohol and tobacco and the time I spent in those industries, just learning how to think outside the box and do things in different ways and create new ways of doing things. Now, here's the thing. So when we think about the industry as a whole, one of the things you mentioned earlier, from seed to sell, you have plant touching business, and then you have non-plant touching. So non-plant touching is considered ancillary, right? Like what we are with media, or if you're an accountant, or if you are in any role that you're not physically touching the plant, you would be considered ancillary. And 100% of the businesses that are ancillary were a business in another industry before, which means you can teach, if you clean, whatever you're doing currently. If you're in law school, right? There are so many ways that you can get involved within the industry that for a lot of people of color is preferable, because it doesn't come with the stigma sometimes that cannabis has in our communities that's really unique to Black and brown people. When I talk to a lot of my readers or followers, I think next to what should we do or how should we structure our business, it is, how do I tell my mom and dad, or how do I say this to my family or my community? Because, our communities are very conservative. So despite the fact we are consumers of cannabis, despite the fact that in a lot of ways, Black and brown people are the culture of cannabis, the business of cannabis is strikingly not Black or brown. It is the opposite of that, right? And so there are a lot of things that people of color in this industry are up against that are outside the business of it. It is just the day-to-day challenges that we face because of our history with the war on drugs and the criminal justice system, and cannabis and how it was kind of used, or marijuana and how it was kind of used to disenfranchise so many of our communities. So we're up against that too, and other businesses aren't up against that. So that's something to consider.
And so do you, through Caller Media, actually do any regulatory work in terms of promoting certain policies to redress those issues, and to promote policies that would just make it easier for individuals to enter into this business in general?
Yeah, I think as a media company, for us, first of all, we try to be we're skewed, of course, but we still kind of try to be as unbiased as possible. But when you're a woman and you're Black, right? You kind of have a skew a little bit. But what we do, and that's what that A is in karma is so important, right? So though we aren't folks who really work with policy or work towards policy or do a lot in that space, we amplify the voices that are, right? And so when we have Deshita Dawson, for example, who comes to mind, is amazing. She's Deshita's from New York, but she's in Portland, and she's also on the Cannabis Regulators of Color, which is an organization, and I believe it's a national organization that, regardless of the state that these regulators are in, they sit together in this organization to make sure that the policies and the laws that are being developed or written or thought about or talked about are monitored, and that we, as people of color, have an eyesight into what these policies are so that we can have a voice in the equity writing. And I love what attorneys and stuff say about it. It's the language, right? So it's in the language of these policies where equity is lost or found, right? And so the work that all these amazing trailblazers that are doing in that policy space is critical. And hearing from them and giving them a platform is something that Black CannaBusiness is really proud to do.
And we know that policy is a major issue when you're starting a business, right? And this is the reason why so many people incorporate in Delaware, right? But another issue, right, is the economics, right? So we want to talk about what are the typical startup costs for cannabis, and in light of the fact that banks aren't giving loans to cannabis businesses, how are most businesses finding the funding? Who are the primary funders? Let's get into a little bit of that.
Well, in everyone's situation, is very different. I think for most startups, right, the first place we go for funding is either ourselves, like resources, money that we've saved or we've earned or what have you, or friends and family, right? You go to mom or dad or uncles or friends who believe in what you're doing and they gift you the money, because what is true is you will not get a loan for the most part, right? Credit is also very difficult because, again, remember, cannabis is still federally illegal. So there's really, you would, in that space, you'd really have to think long and hard about where all of your alternative options for getting, capital could come from. But when you talk to a lot of our entrepreneurs in Black CannaBusiness, a lot of the folks that we even had at the conference as keynotes, all of them were pretty much self-funded or bootstrapped.
Wow. Okay.
Because again, it's one of those things that you're not going to get a loan. And let's be clear too. So it's not just that cannabis businesses may have a challenge raising funds. People of color also have a challenge raising these funds, and so that could potentially be something to consider.
Yeah. So I'm someone, I want to start a cannabis business. Right? I'm interested in this area. It's interesting to me. I feel like I can make some progress in this space, and so I decide to do my EIN number. Right, I get everything set up. And I go to, my parents, I go to my funding, and I say, this is how much I need. What is that number?
It depends on what you're doing. Are you plant touching? Are you not plant touching? Are you, and again, I think, let's say this. I think when I hear numbers, and there's always a range, on the plant touching side, if you want to have like a brick and mortar building, the things you have to consider are your license, which could be, depending on how you obtain your license, that's money. And that's all before you even open the doors, right? If you want to have a dispensary, a lot of times when people think cannabis, they think, I'm going to own a dispensary, because that's the consumer-facing part of the business. Right, so that's what people think, like retail, right? Well, that's also probably one of the most expensive parts or things, to launch or to start, because you're thinking about your license. Then you also have to think about your real estate, right? So where are you going to build? And then with retail, what else do we need? We need POS, and you need, a staff and inventory and all that. So, and that's with any retail store. And the other thing too, I would like to say about like when we're thinking about getting into the business, like what are you doing now? Like what are you good at right now? What profession, what talent, what trade are you really great at? And that's kind of where I would start to think. Like if you have never been in retail or owned it or worked, I would caution you to either do a lot of research first, or think about another way to ease into that particular space, because it can be a little expensive, but it's also the sexy thing. Everybody wants to, because it's a thing to do. But as with most people who are successful in this industry, it takes some research, and it takes time to go around and talk to people and take advantage of these kinds of conversations, so you kind of are educated going in when you're thinking about anything involved. And that's the cannabis and beyond. It's really the research of the industry and really figuring out for yourself how to get in where you fit in.
Okay, and would you say that there are additional risks, perhaps, that you would have to take into consideration? So we know you always want to think about, risk mitigation. You want to think about, cost benefit. So you're entering this industry. Obviously, we know that most startups, are challenging to begin with. A lot of capital, and you're typically not, revenue producing for a number of years, right? Are there additional risks beyond the legal landscape, which is, obviously untenable right now? So you're entering an industry that tomorrow the federal government could just come down on, right? Highly unlikely, but the possibility is there, right? But are there additional other risks that you would have to think of as an investor or as someone who was starting a business specifically that would be unique to the cannabis industry beyond other industries?
You know, I think, again, because the industry is so new, it's very difficult to predict, or a lot of people want projections and what are you gonna do this, in 10 years, 20 years? I mean, we don't know because we haven't really been, we're not federally legislated. So until we're then, I don't know, until we're at that point, it's gonna be really difficult to kind of track, how the businesses are going across the country. It's really state by state, region by region. All business comes with a risk. But again, for Black and brown people, I think what we really have to consider is just know your stuff. Like, educate yourself, go to conferences, go to conventions, immerse yourself in the industry, talk to people who are already in the space, particularly working in areas that you're interested in, to really determine if it's something that you really want to do. And the other thing about the industry, again, is so state specific. So depending on where you are in the country, your access to these people may also be a challenge, right? So that's why it's so important to, there are national conventions and conferences where networking and connecting with people who are interested in doing some of the same things that you're doing is just so important, because it's impossible to start any business without support of others. Yeah. But in the cannabis space, and it's particularly as people of color, without our community support, it's exceptionally challenging, because we're up against so many things outside of just business. Because it's difficult to talk about the challenges of cannabis without circling back to the legalities of it when you're talking to people of color.
Yeah.
So that's really the biggest challenge, because businesses start and fail every single day. So if you have a business acumen and you've run a successful business before, odds are you'll be successful in cannabis also. But you just have to learn the industry and figure out like what role you want to play. And I encourage all of us to just think about how you can add value.
Okay.
Don't repeat what's, if someone's already done this, well, think about another way to do something else. There's plenty of time, there's plenty of space to get involved and to be successful.
Right.
You just got to take your time with it.
Do something different or do something better.
Yeah, be first or best. That's your choices.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And the advice to stay in your wheelhouse.
Yeah,
right? This is what
stay in your lane.
Do this.
Anything you do in any other industry, you can do in cannabis. Yeah. And the thing about cannabis also, which I think is so funny, is, okay, so cannabis is a plant. So it's a living, breathing thing, right? Now, I went to Southern University, which is an agricultural college, so I have a respect for agriculture. Okay. If you don't, then that's another thing I think you should think about, because it's one of those things like, oh, I'm going to own a dispensary. Do you know the shelf life, of cannabis? Are you going to be, are you just going to do a dispensary? Are you going to have like a vertical where you also cultivate, which is a different thing, So it's so much to the plant. And no matter where you are in what business, whether you're ancillary or not, you have to respect the plant, because that's where it all derives from. So knowing how the plant is grown and how it's harvested and how it's shipped and sold from, like you said, from seed to sale, and all those stops in between, those are all the opportunities in the industry for us to be involved. Yeah. You
definitely need some type of a green thumb. Right?
Yeah.
Understand the plant.
The plant touching part. Yes. Yes.
And I think it's great. You said that you're a consumer, right?
Yeah.
So like you gotta have a love for the plant. You gotta have a love for the product.
Yes.
First and foremost, and not just from a business standpoint.
And then it's and the thing about cannabis is, if we really are going to evolve to this place where not only is federally legislated and legal across the country, but that all of our communities have equal access to the medicinal benefits of cannabis, because we can talk all day long about, smoking a joint here or there, or hanging out with your friends, because cannabis is social, and that's where most of us are introduced to the plant. But when you take a step back and you look at the industry as a whole, you realize just how critical the plant is, not only to our community in terms of the health benefits and monetary benefits eventually, but just also as a community dispelling a lot of the myths around cannabis. And so as a person of color in the space, I always encourage my readers and followers to think about like what your why is, and that's with any business. But what's different with cannabis is because of the history of the plant, and in this country in particular, with people of color, it's just really important to know how you're coming in to kind of rewrite the narrative around cannabis for people of color.
Yeah, I think that's very important to think about. So now you threw out earlier the term vertical integration, right? This is the thing, you're talking with experts and they just throw out things, but everyone knows what this is, right? So explain to our viewers just a little bit, what do you mean you talk about vertical integration, specifically in this industry where, the seed to sell, you could either have a structure where someone's touching every part of that, or you can just come in and do one thing. Give us a little bit.
Exactly. So when we think about the whole life cycle of cannabis, when we talk about vertical businesses, it is what complementary parts of that process can we kind of contain, right? So since we talked about dispensary, and that's kind of where I started, we can use this as an example. And I really encouraged all of the students and all the viewers to really research all of the different vertically integrated organizations that exist. Now, one of the first and only international vertically integrated brands is Viola Brands, which is owned by Al Harrington, who was one of our keynote speakers in Black CannaBusiness. But in essence, what it does, what a vertically integrated business is where the business depends on another part of the business, right? So if you're a dispensary, but you're also a cultivator, then your cultivation lab could provide the inventory for your dispensary, but then you could also source out whatever you're cultivating to other dispensaries or to other consumers, right? So it's 2 in 1. So that's the vertical, and some people have more than one. It could be the cultivation, it could be the dispensary, into delivery even, right? Into other types of technology and apps for consumer loyalty and all those things. And so there are just several parts, and I'll start at the dispensary just because that's easy to kind of comprehend, but it's also with technology companies. Lots of integration that we see there. So the vertical integrations in particular. So definitely think about other businesses that are vertically integrated. Like McDonald's is another one that we think about a lot of times because, they're a restaurant and they put this out, but McDonald's also has systems. Yeah. Like when you think about when people start businesses and who has a reputation for getting things in and out and that kind of stuff. So from a consumer facing perspective, McDonald's was where we might go grab something to eat. But from a business to business perspective, McDonald's provides services for other business owners in the space as well. So that's another way when you think about vertical integrations, like what are you also doing that complements your business and that can also bring in another stream of revenue.
Right. So now what would be your position? I know there's a lot of debate on that vertical integrated structure, specifically because you have certain states that are licensing, are legalizing cannabis, and then they're not necessarily prohibiting vertical integration. And from what I understand, typically that's a big business move, right? To have the capital to be able to cultivate and transport and dispense, package, right? So all these are different aspects of the business. And if you don't regulate that, then you could have, theoretically, McDonald's come in and say, we want to do something with cannabis and
take it all,
own the whole thing, right? From start to finish, right? And so I think one of the social justice arguments is that, disintegration, right? Don't allow vertical integration. If you own a dispensary, then you can only own the dispensary. If you own the transport, you can only do the transport. And then this forces, more people into the industry, one, and creates space for, the small, mom and pop, black and brown minority, investment. And to a certain extent, it would force some of these companies, let's just say they get into cultivation, now they don't have a dispensary, so they've got to partner with smaller businesses that are doing the actual dispensary aspect, right? Do you have a position on that? Are you in favor of that argument, or do you think that the vertical integration isn't really a major hindrance to entering the industry?
No, I don't think it's a hindrance. I don't know if I necessarily thought about it to whether or not I have a position on it. I am consummate business person, and so I understand that vertical integrations almost make sense once a business gets to a certain size, because the resources and the tools that they're using to operate, though sometimes it's proprietary, could benefit other businesses. So I think it's all about your perspective. In this space, there's a lot of room. And so I would not, this is not the time to get discouraged. There's plenty, we have probably decades before we get to the point where it's no space or no room for folks coming into this space. But it is any other industry. Restaurants are opening every day, beauty supplies, hair, barbershop, any other business, it's the same thing. You have to know who your customer is. You have to know what differentiates yourself or your product or your services from the competition. And that's really this app business 101, right? It's never about who else is doing it already. It's about how you can come in and do it better or do it a little differently or do it for, your particular customer base versus theirs, right?
Carving out your own niche.
Carving out your niche.
Yeah. Are there certain areas that are perhaps easier to get into than others? So you threw out that retail is probably one of the most difficult, right? You need brick and mortar, you got the licensing, there's a lot there, right?
Mm-hmm.
We haven't even gotten into the conversation about licensing and the stress around that.
Yeah.
But let's just say you want to get into the industry, right? You want another stream of income.
Mm-hmm.
Are there services or spaces that you would say, hey, this is right, it's easy, it's a little bit less cumbersome to get into it? What would be some cannabis related businesses that you would say, are easier to navigate?
To get into.
Right.
Well, of course, anything ancillary is going to be easier just because you're not plant touching, so you don't have to worry about licensing. Oftentimes, it's not, it depends, because even if you're ancillary, maybe you have a lifestyle brand. So a lot of people sell t-shirts or sweatshirts or apparel or things like that, right?
Right.
And so that's the same thing with any other retail stores, inventory and brick and mortar. I think the easiest way to get involved is like what I tell everyone, it's kind of starting where you are. Like, what do you do right now? Are you a teacher? Well, maybe you should look into educating people on cannabis. Are you an attorney or in law school? Then maybe you should start to think about, cannabis law. Are you a cook, right? Culinary is really popular. The culinary arts is really popular in cannabis because of the medicinal benefits of it and how people infuse. You'll hear a lot of people talk about infusing things. That's another one. So it's really, for me and for anyone who's thinking about getting into the cannabis industry, is thinking about, what are you already good at? What skills do you currently have that you can transfer over into the space, and kind of starting there. And then finding your people, right? So if you want to get in the space, find other people who are trying to get into the industry and have conversations with them. And it's one of those things where in business, you're never going to know everything, but it's always an amazing thing to do to make sure that you are immersing yourself, giving yourself an opportunity to spend some time in this industry with people who are in it, to learn from hear from the horse's mouth about what the opportunities and the challenges are. So my advice for anyone who wants to get started is to really sit where you are, think about where you are right now, and how and if you're a nurse, right? There's an organization out of they're headquartered in Shreveport, Louisiana. I have really good friends with the Cannabis Nurses of Color, right? They're our nurses. And then now they have figured out a way to kind of take that skill and leverage it for the industry. So there's so many things that you can do. It's not the time to be discouraged. There'll definitely be some times where you're like, I thought I wanted, and that's just part of it. But that's not specific to cannabis.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything that's specific to cannabis that makes, if you're an entrepreneur and you have an entrepreneurial spirit, it doesn't really matter the industry. You're gonna kind of, figure it out if that's what you want to do. Right. And it's no different with cannabis. Okay. A little bit more research, got to be a little bit more thoughtful and careful about some things, and particularly, like we mentioned, if you want to be on a plant touching side. But again, the resources are there. You can certainly, attend the conferences and learn more about it.
Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit now about predictions. Right.
Okay.
You're the expert, right? So you're in this space and you're seeing a lot. So let's talk first about the Safe Banking Act. You mentioned that earlier, right? Mm-hmm. What do you think is going to happen with that? Do you see it passing? And if so, right, do you think it's going to change the industry significantly?
So, not the expert, but I can tell you from what we've read and what our colleagues have said is that the Safe Banking Act, as it is written, has a lot of gaps in it, specifically around social equity. I encourage you guys again, I can give you some folks to follow and that kind of thing, and I can share some things with you so that even after this conversation ends, you can kind of do your own research. But yeah, there's just a lot of talk on the ground from the activists and the people who work every day, like fighting for cannabis rights for people of color that are not satisfied with the Safe Banking Act as it's written.
Okay.
I think people get excited because the big words and it's like, oh, it's now we're gonna have, we can bank now federally because of this new policy, this new law. But when you look into the fine print, is it really gonna benefit the people of color or the folks that are considered equitable or social equity clients or social equity businesses?
Yeah.
Is the Safe Banking Act really helping them out, or is it more industry wide and not specific to some of those of us who have those challenges with business?
So are we seeing the business development in this space catering to the large, Fortune 100s, or are we seeing the policies that are being put out opening the door for small, mom and pop businesses and for individuals who were, impacted by the war on drugs, right? Is there space? You say there's this is not the time to be discouraged. There's a lot of space here, and I think we all know there's a lot of potential in the future of cannabis, right? But who will be capitalizing off of that potential, right? And are the policies set for smaller businesses to enter and thrive? Or are the policies really, just creating space for these large pharmaceuticals to say, oh, well, now we have this medicinal cannabis, let's do that too, because we know that they will.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the biggest, what was Pfizer, I think was the most recent pharmaceutical company, and they've invested like billions of dollars into the space. I think even more than the policy, policy is a part of it, but we also know that money, pushes people's buttons, right, with policy and things like that. So whereas most of when you think about who writes policy, like what they look like, oftentimes they don't really look like us, and the few of us that are there, we're outnumbered, right? So a lot of it is trial and error. They like with the Safe Banking Act, for example, there were some people who were really excited about it until they read it, the fine print. And then once they read the fine print, they realized that the language in some of these policies were not supportive of people of color or folks who consider themselves equity businesses, right? And then for every state and every region, the challenges are different. So that's why it's just so important to get a bird's eye view of the cannabis industry as a whole, like across the country. But then even more important is to figure out what's going on in your neck of the woods, right? Like what's happening in your state on the ground level. And what's really great, what a lot of us don't really take a lot of advantage of, especially when you're in business because you're so busy. But once businesses get to a certain level in certain industries, they have people who lobby, right, for their interests,
right.
And so that's definitely something that more Black and brown businesses are seeing support from, are those lobbyists who are, at their state capitals on the day-to-day basis, talking to legislatures about, where the opportunities and the challenges exist in the space, and that's ongoing. Yeah. That's always going to happen.
Okay. And in terms of funding, so you threw out that that's one of the main issues. Where are you seeing the funding coming from? Who are the big funders, and are they funding minority, equity interests? Or are these funds only being, again, reserved for a select few?
Well, most when we think about funding in small business, again, a lot of that's private capital, right? It's your retirement or your mom or your husband or your grandparents or someone, you're getting money from there. Like most new industries, a lot of it is private funds. A lot of it is investments or investors. And so thinking through as a business owner, whether you're in cannabis or otherwise, really thinking about what your runway is. So if you're wanting to start a business, how much would that cost? And not getting overwhelmed with, a dispensary is going to cost this. Yeah, but today you don't have a dispensary. Today you're just thinking about it. So, thinking about your plan, looking at where you want to be, and then kind of working backwards and thinking through what money is or what capital is absolutely necessary at that time. A lot of new businesses lose a lot of money, so it's almost beneficial to do the bootstrap first so you can figure out where your real expenses are versus like the ones you've made up or the ones you think you need, right? And then once you develop that MVP or that product that you feel like works, you've sold something, you know, someone's attended it, someone has downloaded it, whatever the thing is that you're wanting to bring to the space, I always suggest in any business to test it out. And the MVP just means a minimal viable product, which means if you eventually want to own a dispensary down the line, what can we do today to test whether or not that bigger idea, right, is going to really work?
Yeah.
And a lot of that is, again, it starts with education.
Yeah. Okay. And so I want to transition just a little bit before I let you go here. This is very helpful information. I'm thinking about getting an ancillary CannaBusiness for myself here. But what are your take on stocks? Are you investing in stocks at all? Do you think that cannabis stocks are going to eventually do well? You know, I've been looking at stocks. I do a little bit here and there, and you know, they're very volatile.
Oh yeah,
You
absolutely.
know, it's up and down depending on an announcement from, you know, Biden today or what current policy may have passed. But is there a recommendation that you think people should be investing in stocks, or you know?
You know what? And that's probably the second most popular question we get at Black CannaBusiness. It is. The first one is, I want to start a business. How do I do it? What do I do? And the second one is, I want to invest, right? Because on one hand, you have people who want to stay where they are. Like maybe you are, you know, a successful musician and you just want to, you know, you have a little money, a little change, and you want to put, you know. So in terms, I'm not an expert on stocks. I know, you know, again, when that A in Karma, we have a lot of Black CannaBusiness readers and contributors who are. So I really encourage you to do some research on that. But again, like we mentioned a minute ago, like Pfizer just put out something like $4 billion or some major amount of money into the space. So again, it's research, as with anything, but especially with stocks. And I think when with people of color and those of us who, again, starting a business, we traditionally start with cash. You know, and in terms of investing in stocks and things, I would have to defer to our folks who do that every day because I'm not a trader.
Got it. Okay. And so tell us, before we let you go, tell us a little bit about what you have planned. I know that you recently had your CannaBusiness conference in New Orleans. And so what's next on the docket for Kristi Price?
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. So many things. So we are really excited because we're going to be launching our editorial division of the Black CannaBusiness magazine this March. So we're excited about that. The Black CannaBusiness conference is annually in New Orleans, and so we'll be in New Orleans again this November, the first week in November at the convention center. So we're always working on that, and then we're also developing a new program that's really close to my heart, and it's called the Black CannaBusiness CEO Intensive. So that's about those of us who are thinking about starting a business, or maybe you already have a business and you need some support. It's almost like a boot camp for cannabis CEOs of color who are at a phase of their business where they're looking to expand or bring on a team or raise money, whatever that new thing is. That's kind of what this CEO Intensive is about. So those are our three big projects this year that we're working on.
Okay, well, I'll definitely be on the lookout. I am definitely going to attend that conference.
You have to come to the conference.
I'm coming to the conference this year.
Thank you
for all the work you do in this space, and thank you for taking time out to speak with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.